Welcome back for part 3, where we're going to talk about transport of substances. So there's a couple different kinds of transport that we're going to learn about. One is called passive transport. Passive transport is just like it sounds. No energy is required. If you're a very passive, you don't expend a lot of energy into something. So it's going to be the movement of molecules through a membrane, and it's not going to require energy input from the cell. So the cell doesn't have to give anything in order for this movement to happen. The molecules are going to move in response to that concentration gradient. So in nature, things flow from a high to a low. So they're going to want to move from where there's a lot of it to where there's a little bit of it. So if we think about that's a type of diffusion, and diffusion is just that movement of molecules from a high to a low. Now, we can have diffusion, just examples all around us. If somebody has perfume on or cologne and they walk by you, you get to smell it because it's diffusing from where there's a lot of it on their body to out in the air where there's not very much. If somebody that you know is baking cookies and you walk into their house, you will smell that wonderful smell. Those are the concentrated particles diffusing into the air around it. So passive transport is just a type of diffusion when we're talking about movement of molecules into and out of cells. Diffusion will continue until the concentration is the same in all areas. So molecules will continue to move until it's equal. So here's an example of passive transport or diffusion, just adding some colored dye to a beaker of water, and you can watch it slowly spread out until all of those molecules are almost equal. So when we have transport across membranes, there are some major barriers to crossing a biological membrane. And one of those major barriers is the hydrophobic interior. We've got that nonpolar region. And that nonpolar region is going to repel polar molecules, but not the nonpolar ones. Like goes with like. So nonpolar molecules will move until the concentration is equal on both sides. There is limited permeability to small, very small polar molecules that kind of are able to slip in through there. And there is very limited permeability or ability to go through to large polar molecules and ions, which they're going to need some help in being able to get across. So we have facilitated diffusion, which is a type of diffusion that's a little bit helped. If you're facilitating somebody or facilitating something, you're helping to lead this process. So facilitated diffusion happens when you have molecules that can't cross the membrane, and they're going to move through proteins that are embedded in the membrane. That's why we just learned about all those different kinds of wonderful proteins. Still, things are going to move from a high to a low concentration, because in nature, things flow from a high to a low. This is a type of passive transport. This is not going to require cell energy. So it's still going to move from that high to the low. You're going to have these channel proteins, which will have hydrophilic channels that will open up and allow those polar molecules to pass through. And then you'll have carrier proteins, which can bind to a specific molecule, and just by the kinetic energy of that molecule, they will change shape and open up onto the other side, releasing that molecule. So we call our membranes selectively permeable because they're only going to allow certain things in, and other things are going to need some help. And this is one way they can get help. Those channel proteins that are embedded in the membranes can be ion channels, which will allow the passage of those ions, those charged particles. You can also have gated ion channels, which will open and close in response to some sort of stimulus, that a chemical or electrical stimulus that your cell is receiving, the cell membrane is receiving. And we have to look at which way the direction of those molecules is flowing. And there's going to be a couple conditions that determine that. how much concentration of the substance is on either side of the membrane. Because remember, in nature, things flow from a high to a low. Anytime we want to go from a low to a high, where there's a little bit of something to where there's a lot, it's going to take some energy. Also, like with our neurons, we have a voltage difference between across the membranes, so that will determine how things can flow. And then these gated channels that can either be opened or closed, which will also determine if things can flow. So here's an example of a channel protein and what it would look like, where we have the molecules out here, the channel is open, they flow from a high to a low. Carrier proteins are just like they sound. They carry or help transport ions and other solutes, like some sugars, amino acids, and other molecules across the membrane. It is going to still require a concentration difference, so an area of high concentration and an area of low concentration. And these carrier proteins, they bind to the molecule that they're transporting. The rate of this transport is limited by the number of transporters, because if you're binding to something, like if you were the one that was carrying people across a bridge, I don't know why you'd be doing that. That's the first example that came to my mind. But if you were the person, you're limited to how many people you can carry at a time, and that could be one. Okay? So only one person can come across with you at a time. If there's two of you carrying people across this bridge, this imaginary bridge, then you would have extra ability to transport proteins. So here's an example of what a carrier protein cartoon would look like. So we've got some molecules that need to cross. That molecule is going to fit just right into that protein. And then because of the weight of the kinetic energy of that molecule, it's going to just basically flow right through that protein. Okay. Then we talk about the movement of water, so specifically the diffusion of water. So the cytoplasm of the cell is a very aqueous or water-filled solution. Water we know is a solvent, water is polar, and there's dissolved substances that are in the water that we would call solutes. So when we're looking at osmosis, we're looking at the net diffusion of water across a membrane towards a higher solute concentration.